It began quietly, too quietly. In the days following the Yu Menglong incident, a series of measures appeared across China that seemed unrelated at first glance. Fishing activities were suddenly restricted in certain regions. Online platforms began filtering not only names but entire phrases. Words that had once been harmless now triggered silence. Entire conversations vanished without explanation. What unsettled observers was not the speed of these actions, but their scale. This was not a localized response. It felt systemic. At the same time, something else began to fracture. China's entertainment industry, once a carefully engineered engine of optimism and distraction, started to collapse in plain sight. Stock prices across major media companies slid day after day. Highly promoted films failed to draw audiences. Projects backed by enormous budgets returned almost nothing. For years, box office success had been manufactured through spectacle, celebrity worship, and relentless promotion. Now those mechanisms no longer worked. The public was not angry. That was the most disturbing part. There were no mass protests. No viral outrage campaigns. Instead, there was withdrawal. Viewers stopped buying tickets. Subscribers quietly canceled memberships. Promotional slogans echoed into emptiness. The audience had not rebelled. It had disengaged. This sudden loss of faith did not come from a single bad movie or a market correction. It followed a name few dared to repeat. Yu Menglong. Officially, the story was simple. A night of drinking. An accidental fall. A tragic but ordinary death. The report was brief. The case, according to authorities, was closed. Yet the public reaction suggested something else entirely. People were not convinced. They were cautious. In online spaces, users spoke indirectly, relying on metaphors and half-sentences. Some said the water could be purified again, but it could also be polluted again, just as easily. Others said nothing at all. We should pause here, because this is where the story truly begins. What does it mean when an audience no longer argues, no longer demands explanations, but instead turns away? In systems built on attention, silence is not neutral. Silence is a signal. And in this case, it spread quickly. Investors began pulling back. Public figures disappeared from view. Celebrities who once dominated screens vanished without farewell. When they returned, urging support for domestic films and cultural unity, the appeals rang hollow. The Yu Menglong controversy had become a boundary. On one side stood official narratives. On the other stood a public that no longer trusted them. What followed was not chaos, but cold order. Discussions were restricted. Certain keywords became untouchable. People warned one another not to message, not to call, not to ask questions that could be traced. Awareness replaced outrage. Self-preservation replaced speech. This was no longer about entertainment. It was about something deeper, something structural. A moment when silence itself began to carry meaning. And that is when many realized the truth. What was unfolding was not the collapse of an industry. It was the exposure of a system that could no longer hide behind distraction. This was not the collapse of entertainment. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The night Yu Menglong died was documented with a precision that appeared, on paper, sufficient. Timestamps were recorded. Locations were identified. A short sequence of events was presented to the public and then sealed. According to the official account, there was no struggle, no third party, no criminal intent. Alcohol was cited. Gravity did the rest. In many cases, that would have been enough. But this death did not settle into silence. It resisted it. The timeline placed Yu Menglong at a private gathering with acquaintances. Witnesses confirmed he had been drinking. Later, he was found in a ditch near the residential area where the gathering had taken place. Emergency services arrived. The conclusion was swift. The wording was careful. A tragic accident. No further details required. Yet almost immediately, fragments began circulating online. Not arguments, not accusations. Fragments. People noticed what was missing. Surveillance footage was not released. Personal belongings recovered that night were described only vaguely. Items were mentioned but not explained. There were no photographs, no diagrams, no expanded briefings. The case closed with an efficiency that felt disproportionate to the attention it had already attracted. In digital spaces where discussion was still possible, users avoided naming the case directly. They spoke in allusions. They referred to that night or the fall. Some asked whether anyone had heard the audio clips that briefly surfaced before disappearing. Others mentioned voices, shouting, crying. Pleas that did not sound like those of a man simply losing his balance. None of this was verified, and that uncertainty became part of the problem. A video circulated for only a short time before being removed. Those who claimed to have seen it described overlapping voices, urgency, confusion. Words like run and do not move were reportedly audible. In the background, some said they heard the sound of an animal crying, almost human in tone. Others dismissed the clip as fabrication. Without confirmation, both positions existed in parallel. What mattered was not whether the footage was real. What mattered was that it felt plausible enough to disturb. As days passed, residents near the site of the incident reported an unusual presence. Security measures were tightened. Access became restricted. Guards were stationed at points that had previously been open. People who lived in the area noticed an increase in patrols, an atmosphere of watchfulness that had not been there before. Then came the listings. Real estate platforms showed a sudden surge in properties for sale in the same community. Apartments that had been occupied for years were put on the market almost simultaneously. There were no official explanations. No statements from property managers. Just numbers. Listings. Quiet departures. A small number of visitors went to the area themselves. They did not stay long. One individual later recounted a brief exchange with a security guard. When asked whether he felt any sense of responsibility for what had happened, the guard responded without hesitation. He said he had no justice and no conscience. He worked for his salary. He advised her to leave before authorities were called. The response spread quickly, not because it was shocking, but because it was honest. This was how the story survived. Not through declarations, but through moments like these. Short encounters. Partial memories. People comparing notes without ever writing them down in one place. At no point did authorities contradict the official explanation. At no point did they expand upon it either. The silence was consistent, controlled, almost rehearsed. We are often taught to associate doubt with noise, with outrage, with protest. But what formed here was different. It was a shared restraint, a collective decision to observe rather than confront. Because once a death becomes difficult to speak about, it stops being just a death. Yu Menglong's name faded from headlines, but his absence grew heavier. It lingered in the gaps between statements, in the sudden caution of online discourse, in the way people avoided eye contact when the topic surfaced offline. The case was closed, the questions were not. And the tension, unresolved and unacknowledged, began to pull other figures into its gravity. Not because they accused anyone, but because they noticed the same thing others did. The explanation ended too neatly. And in systems built on control, neat endings are often the most suspicious. The official explanation closed the case. Public doubt opened something else. The story shifted when attention moved away from the dead and toward the living. It began with a series of online posts that were brief, ambiguous, and unsettling. Lin Buan, a figure known for his indirect connection to military institutions, wrote that he was meeting friends in Shandong's Sunshine District. The message appeared ordinary. Hours later, another post followed. This one suggested unease. He wrote that something felt wrong. There was no explanation, no context, only a sense of impending trouble. By the next day, the tone changed entirely. An account closely associated with Lin posted a message that read less like commentary and more like a warning. It claimed that multiple parties were contacting police simultaneously, accusing him of spreading rumors. The post urged others not to reach out privately. It ended with a single word: remember. After that, the messages stopped. No farewell, no clarification, just absence. Soon, statements began circulating from companies based in Beijing. They issued open letters insisting that their actions were not directed at Lin personally, but at unnamed groups operating behind him. The language was careful, defensive, legalistic. To outside observers, it sounded like a preemptive explanation offered before any accusation had been made. Then came the most alarming development. Posts appeared claiming that Lin had withdrawn from school. Communication channels went silent. Accounts once active ceased all activity. Netizens began speculating that he had been taken away. Not arrested, not charged. Simply removed from public reach. What followed was not panic, but instruction. People began warning one another. Do not text him. Do not call. Do not ask questions. Protect yourself. The tone was calm, almost procedural, as if everyone understood the rules without needing them explained. On an overseas platform, a Russian-language account allegedly leaked personal data connected to the case. 17 names appeared. Screenshots spread quickly before disappearing again. The information was incomplete, but sufficient to send a message. Nothing online was truly private. Every connection could be traced. One emergency post summarized the mood in a single sentence. The situation looks bad. They are trying to trick us. Do not make calls. The system tracks everything. At this point, the case was no longer about Yu Menglong alone. It had become about proximity. About who knew whom. About which conversations might be interpreted as evidence of alignment. Ji Guangguang entered the narrative shortly afterward. On an overseas platform, he published a lengthy statement. Users quickly discovered that he was currently in Thailand. Distance in this context mattered. His post addressed the controversy directly, but narrowly. He confirmed that Yu Menglong had visited his home on the night in question, accompanied by 3 mutual friends. He reiterated the official account, stating that Yu Menglong had been intoxicated and fell accidentally. He concluded with an apology to the family and to the public for any misunderstanding. The statement was precise, controlled, complete. It was also unsatisfying. To many readers, it read less like an explanation and more like a boundary. It answered only the questions that had already been asked officially, while ignoring the ones circulating quietly online. There was no mention of surveillance footage. No clarification about the items reportedly found in Yu Menglong's possession. No acknowledgement of the rumors that had already taken hold. As the post spread, users began examining Ji's background. Public records showed extensive connections to thousands of companies, including state-owned enterprises, banks, and medical institutions. Among them was a hospital previously associated with another controversial death, officially ruled a suicide but still disputed by the family involved. Connections did not prove wrongdoing, but they added weight. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that communications linked to Lin Buan were being reviewed. Messages, calls, contact lists. The fear was not of guilt, but of association. In environments where intent is irrelevant, proximity alone can be dangerous. People adapted quickly. Instead of demanding answers, they adjusted behavior. They avoided certain topics. They stopped engaging publicly. When they spoke, they did so obliquely, using metaphors that only those already aware could understand. This was not ignorance. It was strategy. What was remarkable was how little guidance was needed. No official announcement instructed people to remain silent. No directive was issued. The silence spread organically, reinforced by absence rather than force. This was the moment when the narrative changed shape. A death had raised questions. Those questions led to unease. Unease led to caution. And caution, once shared, became a collective instinct. People were no longer asking what happened that night. They were watching who vanished after asking. People were no longer asking what happened. They were asking who would be next. By the time the focus shifted to what lay beneath the surface, the atmosphere around the case had already changed. What once felt like a singular tragedy now carried the weight of a pattern. Not one that could be proven, but one that could be sensed. The residential complex where Yu Menglong had died no longer resembled an ordinary place. Security was visible and persistent. Visitors noticed guards stationed at entrances where none had existed before. Conversations were short. Questions were unwelcome. The area felt sealed, not officially but socially. Real estate listings told their own story. Dozens of apartments appeared on the market within days. Families who had lived there for years moved without explanation. There were no public notices, no announcements of redevelopment. Just departures, quiet and efficient. One visitor later described approaching a guard with a question that was not confrontational, only human. He asked whether the man felt any sense of moral responsibility for what had happened. The guard did not hesitate. He said he had no justice and no conscience. He worked for his salary. Then he advised the visitor to leave before the police were called. The exchange circulated widely, not because it revealed cruelty, but because it revealed alignment. Responsibility had been replaced by compliance. That substitution, more than any rumor, unsettled observers. It was around this time that a Taiwanese entertainment journalist, Gay Chi, traveled to the location. He said publicly that he wanted to sense the atmosphere for himself. He did not claim to be investigating. He did not accuse anyone. He simply went. While filming near the site where Yu Menglong had been found, something unexpected occurred. A dog appeared without warning. It walked calmly to a specific spot and stopped. There, it lowered its head and began sniffing the ground. It did not bark. It did not move. For several seconds, it remained fixed in place, as if recognizing something invisible. Property staff soon arrived to inspect the area. Sensing the tension, Gay Chi left quietly. That night he checked into a nearby hotel. He later recounted that after lying down, he made a brief phone call to confirm that he was safe. Moments after ending the call, a doorbell rang. The sound was clear and deliberate. Startled, he opened the door. 5 unfamiliar individuals stood in the hallway. No words were exchanged. No explanation was offered. The encounter ended as abruptly as it began. Gay Chi later shared photographs from that night. When viewers compared them to earlier images from the residential complex, something unsettling emerged. The spot where the dog had stopped earlier that day was only a single step away from where Yu Menglong's body had once been found. Comment sections filled with speculation. Some referenced long-held beliefs that animals perceive what humans cannot. Others warned the journalist to remain cautious, reminding him that discussions surrounding the case were being increasingly restricted. The story did not end there. On a later television appearance, Gay Chi spoke more broadly about his experiences within Beijing's entertainment industry. What he described shocked many viewers. He referred to gatherings that existed beyond public view. Private events attended by powerful agents, celebrities, and executives from major media platforms. He said these spaces operated under different rules. Drinking was excessive, boundaries blurred, business decisions intertwined with personal indulgence. He described an environment where influence was currency and silence was expected, where favors were implied rather than stated, where declining participation carried consequences that were never documented. His account did not name individuals. It did not accuse specific crimes. But it painted a picture of a culture that thrived on discretion and mutual protection. Around the same time, another voice emerged. Chi Lai, the head of a Beijing media headquarters, began posting a series of statements online. She alleged that a media company once connected to Yu Menglong had threatened her after she refused to resume cooperation. Screenshots accompanied her posts. Messages urging silence. Messages implying consequences. Messages that escalated quickly. One read simply, "If you do not behave, we will not be responsible for what happens next." She claimed that on October 20th, she narrowly avoided being struck by a car in the morning. That same evening, her vehicle was hit from both sides by 2 other cars. Several members of her staff were injured and hospitalized. Police registered the incident as a traffic accident. Her team believed otherwise. Days later, she posted again. The harassment, she said, had intensified. Her family was being targeted. Her child. Her friends. One message stood out. "Do not worry. I will kill you." Support poured in online, both domestically and overseas. Many urged her to stay safe. Others described the situation with words that echoed across platforms. Too dark. Too deep. Still, no conclusions were drawn. No investigations announced. No denials issued. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Those who approached the edges of the story encountered resistance. Not always direct, sometimes symbolic, sometimes psychological, sometimes delivered through coincidence. Behind closed doors, the machinery continued to function. Public narratives remained intact. Official explanations stood unchallenged. But beneath them, an undercurrent persisted, carrying fear, restraint, and recognition. At this stage, silence was no longer the absence of speech. It had become a language of its own. At this point, silence was no longer absence. It was a message. By the time the noise subsided, something else had taken its place. There were no rallies, No chance. No declarations demanding justice. Instead, a quiet pattern emerged across the country. Viewership declined. Cinema seats remained empty. Memberships were not renewed. Promotional campaigns echoed without response. What once relied on constant engagement now faced an unfamiliar opponent: indifference. This was not apathy. It was restraint. People understood the limits of direct confrontation. They also understood the value of withdrawal. In a system sustained by participation, refusal carried weight. It did not announce itself. It did not require coordination. It simply spread. Online, messages circulated carefully. We cannot help him directly. We must not make things worse. Do not call. Do not message. Do not draw attention. Protect yourself. These were not orders. They were instincts, shared without leadership or structure. Each individual decision seemed small. Together, they formed a boundary. The entertainment industry felt the effects first, but it was never the true target. Films failed not because of quality alone, but because audiences no longer trusted the environment that produced them. Celebrity appeals rang hollow. Calls to support domestic culture were met with silence. Viewers had learned to read between lines that were never written. This form of resistance did not seek answers. It acknowledged their absence. We should be clear. No official conclusion was overturned. No hidden document was revealed. The Yu Menglong case remained, on record, resolved. Yet its impact persisted precisely because it could not be spoken about freely. The inability to discuss it became part of its meaning. Silence changed shape. It no longer represented fear alone. It became memory. A way of holding on to unresolved questions without placing them into words that could be traced, recorded, or erased. In this context, remembering was safer than speaking. Observing was safer than accusing. Across platforms, comments appeared that captured this shift. We are not asking for conclusions. We are standing for a bottom line. Every life deserves to be taken seriously. Even if our effort is only a drop, one day the ocean will rise. These statements did not challenge authority. They challenged indifference. What made them powerful was not their reach, but their persistence. They returned again and again, altered slightly each time, never fixed in one place long enough to be removed entirely. They did not demand agreement. They asked only to be noticed. At the center of it all remained a simple truth. Something had happened that could not be explained away by routine language. The official story had closed the file, but it had not closed the wound. And wounds left unattended do not disappear. They change the way people move around them. Perhaps this is how systems are tested. Not by open revolt, but by the moment when participation becomes conditional. When audiences decide quietly that they will no longer play their assigned role. In the end, no one could say what would come next. The story did not resolve itself. It did not need to. Because maybe truth does not always need to be spoken. Sometimes it only needs to be remembered. Maybe truth does not always need to be spoken. Sometimes it only needs to be remembered.